Testing, testing. This is a Blackboard Collaborate testing session. Testing session number 1. We'll be going over a few moments of basic EMT review of oxygen and airway management, starting off with the anatomy and physiology of the upper airway. The upper airway begins at the nasopharynx, which is that top chamber you see up in the diagram right there. From there, as the air enters the airway into the nasopharynx, it is warm, humidified, swirled around, where it ultimately enters the back of the throat to what's called the oropharynx. The oropharynx and the nasopharynx meet up in an area called the hypopharynx, which is continuous with the laryngopharynx, which enters and swirls the air and brings it down into the trachea. The trachea is otherwise known as the windpipe, and posterior to the trachea is the esophagus, which is a passageway for food to enter into the digestive system. Very important structure separating the trachea and the esophagus is this flap of tissue over here called the epiglottis. The epiglottis is important for covering over the trachea when swallowing so that food does not enter the airway. When you look at the lower airway, the border of the lower airway is usually found at this structure right here called the larynx. The larynx is composed of the thyroid cartilage, otherwise known as the Adam's apple, and below it is another prominent cartilage called cricoid cartilage. Inside the larynx, you have the voice box, you have the vocal cords, which is the narrowest part of the adult airway, as opposed to the child and the infant, whose narrowest part of the airway is the cricoid cartilage. So as air travels down the trachea is a rigid structure surrounded by 10 to 12 semicircular rigid cartilaginous rings. And then it bifurcates or separates at an area called the carina to the left and right main stem bronchi. The bronchi are further tubes that protrude into the lung structures, and again are surrounded by cartilage, so they're nice and sturdy. So they divide and divide and divide and subdivide, and after about 20 subdivisions or so, they turn into structures called bronchioles. Bronchioles are smaller air passageways that are not surrounded by cartilage. They're just flimsy, soft tissue, and they're subject to collapse and spasm until finally when you want to get to the last part of the airway, which is known as the alveoli. The alveoli are these membranous type sacs that look like clusters of grapes, where oxygen is diffused from the airway into the bloodstream, and conversely, carbon dioxide is diffused from the bloodstream back into the airway. I'm going to end this session now, so I'm going to stop recording.